And without the WA being able to provide these services anymore, I think there's a lot of questions about the long-term sustainability of the revolution.
Hello and welcome to episode 41 of What's Happening in Myanmar, a weekly show from the Frontier Myanmar podcast family. I'm your host, Luke Corbin. Today, it's Friday, August 22, and we have two great guests for you. Stephen Campbell from Nanyang Technological University in Singapore, and Joseph Young, a colleague here at Frontier Myanmar. We'll be covering two developments in Myanmar this week, and it's a bit of a longish episode, so let's just dive straight in. The first development this week is that Daw Myo E, the chair of the Solidarity and Trade Union Myanmar, that's STUM, along with 9 other union members, they have been sent to Yangon's Insein prison after recent court appearances. The military abducted Myo E in Yangon's Sripita township back on July 25. Plainclothes officers also raided the union's office in the township that night and detained more union members, with others detained in the days since, including one who was taken away at a checkpoint on the Yangon-Mandalay Expressway. Daw Myo E was previously detained in April 2021 and served a sentence of 6 months in Insein prison for incitement at that time. There's no official statement about exactly why the union members were targeted, nor any details on the charges that they face beyond being detained as a supposed threat to law and order. So things are still quite murky. But all this seems to have occurred only after a complaint was made by a factory owner about the union, and there are reports that more factory owners have been surreptitiously speaking to military authorities after the union members were detained, voicing their own complaints against the STUM. Now, the STUM, for its part, has demanded that their members be released, to no response. Earlier this year, the union was involved in some of the most successful industrial action since the 2021 coup. Now, Myo E actually spoke on the record with Frontier in June about the garment worker strikes that led to wage gains in Hlaing Thaya. Those strikes were back in May. For more, you can read Frontier's feature story online or listen back to episode 33 of this podcast. As Myo E told Frontier at the time, quote, "Previously, as soon as workers made demands, the factory owners would call the military, which would come in and threaten the workers. But this time, they didn't face such a response. So workers in other factories followed the same path and went on strike too." Well, to unpack what's going on here, I'm pleased to welcome Stephen Campbell to the show. Stephen is Associate Professor in the School of Social Sciences at Nanyang Technological University, Singapore. He's a long-time workers' rights advocate and a scholar of labour and capitalism. He's written about Myanmar for over a decade with multiple publications, replete with rich narratives and critical scholarship. It's a real pleasure, Stephen.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to have this discussion.
Well, after that introduction, I should also say that you actually know Daw Myo E and you've worked with the STUM. Maybe we could just start with that.
Sure. Well, I first met STUM and WA. I suspect it was probably around 2017 when I first visited Shuibida Township. But my closest relationship with them was in 2019. I was living in Shuibida Township to do research on labor and working conditions in the industrial zones there. And during that time, I was teaching weekly English classes in the STUM office, the office which the police have now closed. So I got to know Daw Myo E quite well, along with her daughter, who's also in custody at the moment, and other STUM members. And I accompanied them on several occasions to some labor rights protests that they were involved in. The STUM is really quite interesting. The organization was formed in 2016 in response to their experiences with some quite patriarchal union practices, specifically with the Myanmar Trade Union Federation, but it's a critique that has been voiced regarding other unions in Myanmar in general about being quite male-dominated. But in the garment sector in Myanmar, the workers are 90% women. And so STUM formed in part as a response to this. And so it's definitely brought forth a certain feminist agenda to the labor organizing work.
Really? So there's some layers here to the struggle. Myo E sounds like she's quite a fighter.
Yeah, well, she's a very strong personality. She's kind of one of the figures who led this push to form STUM, and I definitely had a really positive experience with her. And it's worth noting also the role of STUM after the 2021 coup. So initially, there were a group of 16 Myanmar labor unions and organizations that formed the Myanmar Labor Alliance that sought to galvanize workers and labor activists and organizers together in response to the coup. And it was a sort of unified movement after the coup, but there was subsequently some differences of opinions that emerged. And many of the activists and organizers who faced repression by the military fled the country and put a lot of emphasis on international advocacy and mobilizing sanctions against the SAC. However, UWSA and STUM decided to continue trying to support worker organizing on the ground inside Myanmar, despite the fact that, as you mentioned, UWSA had been imprisoned for 6 months after the coup. So despite that, she remained and STUM remained under very difficult conditions. As you also mentioned, the military has been involved in repressing worker organizing. But it is important, although it has been very restrictive since the coup, it has not completely extinguished worker organizing. There has been regular organizing. Workers have attempted to organize, to go on strike. In some cases, this has been repressed. Workers have been arrested. However, there have been, as you mentioned, some situations where workers have indeed been able to make gains. And so within this very difficult space, STUM and UWSA have been doing some what I see as very important work, but definitely very difficult. And to be honest and fair, it's also been limited. The gains that workers have made have, in many respects, been limited by the high levels of inflation in the country. So workers have been able to make some wage gains, but because of the high inflation, especially after the coup, these wage gains have not nearly come close to what's needed for workers to be able to maintain something like an adequate livelihood in the country. But nonetheless, STUM and UWSA have done some important work trying to support these workers, and as well as raise international awareness about ongoing worker struggles within Myanmar since the coup.
Yeah, and in terms of some of the sort of discrete movements and strikes that were successful that you mentioned, the wage gains achieved in the Yangon garment factories earlier this year were really, from where I'm standing, as close to a good news story as we get these days for workers in Myanmar, in terms of the lack of obstruction and reprisals by military authorities. But maybe that was too good to be true. Do you think that the military regime is punishing the STUM for their support of this successful industrial action in Kleinthea earlier in the year, or are the detention of these members unrelated, given that those strikes were a few months back?
Well, it's all going to be a bit speculative because we don't know for certain. I think it's fair to say, or there's a good chance, that the SAC authorities are making the connection with the ongoing activism and organizing of STUM in their current arrest of UWSA and her colleagues from STUM. But the more recent news reports about this arrest have suggested that there's a very specific factory that they were organizing with, this Warinda factory that was producing bags for export. And at least this recent article by Mazima suggests that this current arrest of UWSA is in connection to that. However, I don't think that needs to be seen as completely separate from a military or response to the earlier successful strikes, or just to the general kind of involvement of STUM, because the situation is very ambiguous to the extent to which the military has not completely abolished the existing labor protection laws in the country. So they're trying to suggest that, in fact, it's still legal to have unions in Myanmar, and there are still legal labor rights. This is what the SAC has at least superficially stated. At the same time, in practice, we know that it's very repressive. But the result is that there is this ambiguous situation that workers are facing where it may, in fact, be possible to organize, to strike, to make gains. But there's always a risk that the military will step in with a more forceful response. So on the one hand, this creates certain openings and certain opportunities that maybe this time workers might think it might be possible to make some gains. But there's this intervention that happens, and so this, I think, is a significant setback, if only for giving workers the sense that, well, the military is in fact going to come in and make arrests if we do pursue these gains. So the recent development with the arrest of Dom Yomere suggests not a very positive turn in the space for worker organizing in the country.
Thank you. And you've brought up there the sort of superficial appearance of law and order that the military regime likes to create. Now, that reminds me of a journalist that I spoke to about this story who told me that at the big picture level, these union arrests are actually directly related to simply keeping Yangon quiet and docile in the lead up to the military's planned elections at the end of the year. Protests for any kind of rights, whether it's labor or anything else, protests mean attention, a disturbance. And the regime is trying to, and I quote this journalist, they're trying to oppress the people in the areas they control as much as they can in the lead up to the election. So can you see the arrests in this light? Is that a fair observation?
Well, I think that's a fair assessment in relation to maybe the military's approach to preparing the groundwork for the so-called elections that will come up. But the problem with the labor organizing is that the military has tried to suggest that it is okay to engage in so-called non-political labor rights work in accordance with the existing labor laws. But it is not okay to engage in what they would see as political, especially anti-military organizing. The problem is that worker organizing is always political. And so, as you mentioned, even if only the sort of disruption that comes with strikes, it's never just about wages. It's always a question of, well, what we have are workers who are trying to assert some sort of democratic process in the workplace. This is a political act, and the military, on the one hand, they want to come across, although it's difficult, we are not persuaded by this, but claiming to be kind of a rule of law regime, and that still has laws in place for labor organizing and labor rights and labor protection. But in practice, when workers organize, it's a political act, and in the lead up to these elections, I trust that the military, the SAC, is perceiving this as not simply disruptive at the level of the workplace, but also an indication of dissatisfaction with the current situation. And in that respect, I think that it's possible, if they do hold these what they want to have, these elections, that subsequently they will try to then claim again, no, the labor protection laws remain in force and it's still legal to form unions. But even then, we are likely to see continued repression, because even under, and it's important to note this, even under the pre-coup National League for Democracy government, there was also worker repression. And during the COVID period, labor organizers were harassed and in some cases arrested. Police, and even in some cases, sort of vigilante thugs were hired by employers to attack worker strike camps. So this is something that is not unique since the coup, but definitely since the coup, its repression is heightened. And I suspect actually that STUM may be allowed to continue existing, if only informally. And Dom Yomere will hopefully be released as soon as possible, along with the 9 other members. But it is also worthwhile to note that there are other worker organizers, activists, unions in the country working. FGWM is an important example, the Federation of General Workers of Myanmar, who are very active with garment factory worker organizing. So STUM is not the only union. It is one of the unions. It's an important one. But there are other organizations, and there are also workers who are not affiliated with any union or labor rights group that are also engaging in workplace organizing. And so this is happening despite military rule, and going forward, despite repression, we're going to continue to see worker organizing, including strikes. And I believe that these are things that anyone who is committed to supporting the democracy movement in Myanmar should be supporting worker organizing in the country, because these are important aspects of democratizing first the workplace, but then society more generally through a sort of bottom-up process, what my colleague Komong and I have called democratization from below, which is not just about replacing the SAC with an elected government, but supporting the grassroots efforts of ordinary people in Myanmar to collectively organize, to assert some sort of democratic process in their communities and their workplaces.
Thanks, Stephen. That's quite interesting that you've brought up the democratic side, the political side of worker organizing, and you also drew on some continuities there from before the coup. So I thought I'd like to ask you a little bit more about that to finish up. You've written quite a bit critically about the term transition that was often applied to this time of political and economic reforms, starting with the Insein period of government under the 2008 constitution, which ostensibly ended, with the military coup of 2021. You've written that these really difficult current conditions for workers after the coup are actually, part of a long history of structural adjustment in the economy and rural dispossession in Myanmar. So you would have thought that the National League for Democracy were a duly elected government from 2016 to 2021. Democratization on the factory floor should have been supported, as that party was ostensibly in power with a mandate to institutionalize democracy. It's a common refrain to blame controversial actions or inactions by the NLD on their fear and the prospect of a military takeover. Do you think that's fair? Could you reflect a bit on before the coup?
Definitely during the NLD period, there was repression of worker organizing, if not to the extent that we've seen post-coup. And I'm not persuaded by the argument that this was somehow just because of the military. The NLD pursued an economic agenda of promoting a foreign investment-driven, export-oriented economic model. And what this meant in practice is that they endeavored to create a stable, quote unquote, stable and welcoming environment for foreign direct investment. And there's been quite a lot written about this. And what this means in practice is that worker organizing is perceived to threaten foreign investment, because when workers are organized, when workers can demand better working conditions and better wages and demanding a say in the management of the workplace, that foreign investors are going to be wary of putting their money in. So this gives some motivation to any government, elected or not, that is pursuing such an agenda to clamp down on worker organizing. This was also the case where we saw anti-dispossession struggles, where farmers or rural dwellers who were organizing to claim back land that had been taken from them. The most famous example was the Lepadon copper mine case. And in that case, too, the workers were told that they were not going to be given their land back because doing so would threaten future foreign investment, and that foreign investment was needed to provide jobs for people like those who were being dispossessed of their land. It was this circular argument. And so there's a bigger question that needs to be asked here about the sort of economic agenda that is being advanced in Myanmar, even under an elected government, because we see regularly with, these officials of these elected governments who are pandering to foreign investors. And if this was the only option, if there was no other economic model available to Myanmar, then perhaps there would be some sort of rationale to that argument. But there were alternatives, people who are questioning, for example, the large-scale land dispossession that was happening in Myanmar, which was justified on the need to promote foreign investment. It does seem, in my view, that to address the more structural factors underlying the repression of worker organizing in Myanmar, that the people of Myanmar should have the space to debate more broadly the sorts of economic models that they want to pursue, and not feel as though they are forced to accept this very narrow model of foreign investment-driven, export-oriented development.
That's a great way to finish, Stephen. Thank you for your thoughts and for the context you've provided. Let's hope that Daw Myom Yo E is out soon. So thanks for coming on What's Happening in Myanmar.
Well, thanks so much for having me on. It was a delight to talk with you, and let's hope that Dom Yomyoe and her colleagues are released as soon as possible.
I should also take this opportunity to let you know, listeners, that there is an online Zoom panel on Monday, August 25, starting at 2:30 Yangon time, being run by the Australia-Myanmar Institute, and it's on the apparel sector, the state of Myanmar's apparel sector, which is, of course, estimated to provide around 500,000 jobs. 90% of workers are women, and at the time of the coup was on a remarkable growth trajectory. So that Zoom panel will be with Vicky Bowman and Jaw Pyo. So if you're interested in that, please go to the Australia-Myanmar Institute website, and then you can get the link and the details and join that panel. And I should also remind you that Frontier Myanmar has a second podcast, a much older podcast named Do Athan, which means our voice. It's a bilingual show in both English and Burmese languages focused on human rights in Myanmar, and the latest episode just dropped a few days ago. Regime refuses permits to repair earthquake-damaged mosques. So please support Do Athan, have a listen, get it on all the normal podcast apps. Now back to the show. The second development takes us out of Yangon and back to the national context. It's been another 7 days of intense attacks by the military across the country as they press their advantage to retake as much territory as possible, likely in preparation for a quieter conflict period preceding the campaign period of the orchestrated elections planned for the end of the year. So let's start off with some of the airstrikes. On Sunday, the Air Force bombed a tungsten mining hub in Pasong Township in Kayar or Karenni State, killing at least 32 people, including 5 children, and injuring at least 17. The Karenni Nationalities Defence Force has controlled the area since January last year. That same day, the military bombed Mogok once again after the devastating airstrike there just last week, killing another 3 people. And on Monday, an airstrike on a monastery in Dabayin Township killed at least 6. On Friday, today, a strike on a village in Gorlin Township killed a family of 3. Residents there said the airstrike was part of a series targeting several villages along the road connecting Shrebo to Myitkyina. Now on Tuesday, in a major symbolic exchange of territory, the military recaptured Damoso town in Kayar or Karenni State. Resistance forces seized Damoso shortly after the major offensive that was launched in November 2023. It's just down the road from Loikor, the capital of the state, which the regime now controls in full. Damoso has been frequently toured by visiting Myanmar revolutionaries living in exile via the Thailand border, and now the military may continue advancing south or west from Damoso along the 2 main roads, those 2 roads which are mostly still under resistance control. Further north from there, after the military retook Nangcho from the Ta'ang National Liberation Army, the TNLA, on July 16, soldiers have been steadily advancing towards other TNLA positions around both Mogok and Jautme. In the Jautme offensive this week, airstrikes killed 10 internally displaced people and injured nearly 20 more, and thousands were displaced. Heavy clashes in villages just 25 kilometres from Jautme have killed an unknown number, but locals are reporting devastation. And these military attacks in Shan State were complemented by increasing propaganda efforts this week. The military regime cajoled, in some instances bribed, people to turn out onto the streets to demonstrate in several towns that the regime controls across Shan State, including the state capital Taunji. Civil servants and locals were told to wear traditional clothes and protest against the TNLA and the Myanmar National Democratic Alliance Army, MNDAA. Local Shan civil society and armed groups condemned the demonstrations as an attempt by the military to divide populations and stir up ethnic tensions. And elsewhere, the military also reportedly regained 4 positions from the Arakan Army, the AA, in Jalpyu on Saturday. However, it suffered a defeat in Ngapir Township, according to the AA, who said they are chasing down retreating troops. As the military's offensive on the TNLA gains steam and promises to buttress military strongholds in Mandalay and Punalwin from any attacks coming from the east, the AA's much talked about ability to pressure the military's lowland factories from the west is becoming more important to the diffuse revolution against military rule that was re-energized following the 2021 coup. The AA has made careful public statements saying that it is not as vulnerable to pressure from China to cease fighting as its northern Shan state allies were. And we learned a little bit more about that pressure this week. The United Wa State Army, UWSA, this Wednesday informed its allies, the SSPP, TNLA, and MNDAA, reportedly reluctantly, that it would no longer provide them with financial and military support. This is according to a carefully worded report put out by One Newsland. Apparently, during a meeting with UWSA officials in China's Yunnan province last year on August 27, the Chinese Special Envoy for Asian Affairs, Deng Xijun, threatened that his government would sever economic ties with the Wa Group if it didn't cease providing military supplies to the MNDA and the TNLA. Chinese officials apparently froze billions of dollars in assets belonging to UWSA officials and companies, as well as imposed sweeping border restrictions and threatened even harsher action if the group didn't end its support for its allies. UWSA officials said Chinese authorities have held the UWSA responsible for the fighting in northern Shan State since the TNLA and MNDAA launched Operation 1027 in October 2023. The One Newsland report said that the MNDAA, TNLA, and SSPP have expressed, quote, understanding and acceptance, quote, of the UWSA's decision. And I'm pleased now to be joined by Joseph Young, the daily briefing writer here at Frontier Myanmar. So, Joe, you're at the coalface every day, fact-checking and writing, in concert with the newsroom, of course, the daily briefing newsletters that go out to Frontier members every afternoon. So I'll ask you directly, did you suspect that the UWSA had been facing this pressure from China for the last year, an entire year?
Yes, of course. Shortly after the Myanmar National Democratic Alliance seized control of the northern Shan hub of Lasho, there was a report by Myanmar Now and some other independent media outlets that some officials from Beijing met with UWSA officials in Yunnan province in southern China. And during this meeting, the Chinese officials scolded the UWSA leadership for its perceived support of the MNDAA, which the UWSA and MNDAA have decades-long ties with each other. And in fact, the UWSA even deployed troops in Lasho, essentially to help protect its liaison office in Lasho, but was perceived as China as assisting the MNDAA's takeover of the city. And during the meeting, the Chinese officials demanded the UWSA to cease its support for the MNDAA and sending supplies to Kokon-controlled areas in northern Shan. And if the UWSA did not do this, Beijing threatened to cut off border crossings with UWSA territory. And when the UWSA Vice Chair Zhao Guoan met with the TNLA, MNDAA, and SSPP representatives, he told them that Chinese officials have also arrested Wa leaders in China, seized their assets in China worth billions of dollars. And this kind of pressure on UWSA by China is quite unprecedented. And because of this, the UWSA decided that they need to publicly announce to their allies that they'll cease support in terms of financial support, but as well as military supplies to the TNLA, SSPP, and MNDAA.
And what about the press release, the public statement by the UWSA? Like, did you read anything into its style, timing, or maybe the three groups that the UWSA decided to explicitly address with it?
So regarding the MNDAA and the TNLA, those two armed groups are quite relevant to northern Shan, as those are the two armed groups that spearheaded Operation 1027 in the region in October 2023. And ever since the operation, the Brotherhood Alliance has seized control of much of the region and had really tipped the balance of power in the region at the expense of the military, which was perceived as Beijing as really upsetting the power balance in Myanmar. And China later feared that the military could even collapse due to these defeats. And threaten Chinese investments and cause chaos without a firm central authority in Myanmar. And to try to scale back the advances as well as the territory seized by the MNDAA and TNLA, Beijing was very keen to apply pressure to the UWSA, which is basically the main benefactor of the MNDAA and TNLA. And so if the UWSA can cut this kind of economic and military lifeline to these two armed groups, they'd be forced to negotiate with the military.
Yeah, which of course is exactly what the military wants. The TNLA in particular is under immense pressure from the military on the Mogok front, on the Jalme front, and of course it's already lost Naung Cho. It's also repeatedly made clear in public statements that China is pressuring it to negotiate with the military, and there are even upcoming peace talks actually scheduled. Of course, the military demands that the TNLA has to return control of 5 towns, I think it is. So far, the TNLA has refused to countenance that. But without the UWSA in even their most cursory of corners, it doesn't look good for the TNLA, does it?
No, it does not. Because even before the UWSA's announcement, TNLA troops for weeks or months have been complaining about a shortage of ammunition and that they have been outgunned by the military. So it looks like even before then, the TNLA supply lines with UWSA were cut off. And in fact, there's even a story about some UWSA servicemen that were given very harsh sentences by the UWSA state government because they were smuggling to other armed groups. And while it wasn't said, there was a lot of speculation that the armed group in question was the TNLA. So it seems that the UWSA is not making empty threats. They're really following through with the blockade of military supplies to the TNLA.
So what do you think? This declaration by the UWSA, is it something that historians will look back on as the turning point in the first 4 years of revolution following the 2021 coup? The moment when China's overwhelming containment of the resistance movement against the Myanmar military, against its coup, the moment when that overwhelming pressure was really laid bare.
Yes, I would say at this point it does truly look like a watershed moment. Because ever since the coup occurred, the UWSA has been officially neutral. However, behind the scenes, it's played an instrumental role in sending not just normal weapons, but heavy weaponry to various resistance groups. And as we talked about, these include the MNDAA and TNLA. But there's been reports that they've also sent aid to groups like the Karenni Nationalities Defense Force, further south in Karenni State. And the UWSA has basically been the ammunition factory for the resistance. And without the WA being able to provide these services anymore, I think there's a lot of questions about the long-term sustainability of the revolution.
So is that also it for Operation 1027, the much lauded operation? I remember when coup leader Min Aung Hlaing, felt that even Punalwin was going to be threatened. He floated the possibility of moving the Office of Training and other military institutions from Punalwin down to Yizen near Naypyidaw. So if maybe that was the heady height of Operation 1027, can we say now that it's reached its conclusion? The only question remaining is how much more territory the military will take back from these armed groups that are now so vulnerable to China's directives.
To me, it's really hard to see how it can continue going forward because when you look at the kind of military's advances in northern Shan, the TNLA just does not seem to be able to properly resist them. Like, it just seems that nearly every other few days you hear about a new village falling to the military or they're recapturing a military base, and it doesn't seem like the TNLA has any ability to counter this advance. And their long-term ability to hold control of Chalpme, Sipal, Mogok very much looks like it's into question, and it's really hard to see how they can hold on to these towns under the current circumstances.
Yeah, and in this new context, the UWSA has also been making some overtures to the military in other ways too, right?
They have been really trying to make themselves seem more friendly to Naypyidaw. For an instance, when there was the March 28th earthquake, much of Naypyidaw was completely destroyed. And there was even a meeting where the UWSA officials reportedly donated some money to the regime to assist in the reconstruction of the capital. And the UWSA officials also attended a so-called peace summit organized by the regime in June. And last month, there was also major flooding in Wa territories in northern and eastern Shan. And the UWSA made it a point to show photos of regime soldiers donating aid to Wa country. And even a few weeks ago, the UWSA sent a letter of condolence to the regime for the death of acting President Myint Sui. So it seems that the UWSA, whether it's due to Chinese pressure, is very keen to show has more friendly relations to Naypyidaw, which is quite a shift compared to the past, where shortly after Operation 1027, Myint Online had very coded statements indicating he believes that the UWSA was supporting the Three Brotherhood Alliance, even to the point of allowing the Brotherhood to launch attacks from Wa territory against the military.
But they're still not caving to everything that the military wants. Like, for example, they've refused to allow polling in their areas for the regime's elections planned for later in the year.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a red line that how far the UWSA will go to essentially placate the military. And I think being able to have the military come in Wa territory and hold elections is very much a non-factor for the UWSA. Even before and during more stable times like 2010 and 2015, the UWSA never allowed elections in its territory.
Okay, I think we've got the big picture on this story covered, but I want to ask you another question more granularly. Like, once the dust has settled in northern Shan State, and assuming the military keeps and grows its advantage there, thanks to China, how do you think this will affect the wider revolution in Myanmar? In particular, the post-coup armed groups that operate in the dry zone. And of course, several of those groups helped with 1027 and then stated publicly that they were going to move their operations down back to the dry zone.
Well, I think there's two different factors to consider. Is one, in terms of what tactics they may use, because ever since Operation 1027, there's been a huge emphasis in taking towns, and often very dramatic ways. But with the military's increasing use of very advanced drones, that seems like that will become increasingly difficult, with these towns essentially being just leveled, with the resistance having no way of being able to combat that. So I think there's going to be a lot of questions of what strategy they will do, whether they return to the more hit-and-run tactics before Operation 1027. They focus more on seizing control of roads. And another aspect is who the main benefactors of these dry zone armed groups will be. Because I would assume that going forward, these armed groups will have to be forced to lessen their dependency on the northern Shan armed groups. And what seems possible is that they will instead focus more on support from the Arakan Army, the Kachin Independence Army, as well as the Chin Resistance. Last month, in fact, some Chin armed groups, as well as the Ya Army, which is a resistance group in the Ya region in northern Mugwe, had recent meetings with one of the senior officials of the KIA, Gunma, and which could be a sign that rather than focus on supply lines from northern Shan into the central part of the country in the dry zone, they may shift to trying to create a kind of arc of resistance from Rakhine State to Kachin State that would also span into Kachin State and the central Myanmar and Sagaing and Mugwe.
Yeah, that's interesting, and it makes sense. Hey, this has been fun. Thanks so much, Joe. You know, many of our listeners, they read your daily briefing reports every weekday, and I'm sure that they enjoyed being able to hear your voice and a bit more of your analysis on the podcast. So, keep up the great work, and let's talk to you again soon.
Yeah, no problem. I'm happy to be on here.
All right, and by way of closing, let me say thanks to you listeners for keeping up with what's happening in Myanmar. Be sure to check out the new content up on the Frontier Myanmar website. There's actually 3 features, well, 2 features and 1 photo series that have been put up since the last podcast. We've got one on Zakung Ting Ying trying to rebuild his empire in what used to be Kachin Special Region 1, and then also one on quake-damaged mosques, based on similar reporting to the Do Athan episode I spoke about earlier. And a little quick heads up that next month we'll be having a Frontier panel event, a political update to assess the regime's recent moves. That's going to be on September 10, so mark your calendars. Remember that you can email the show with your questions and feedback. whimyanmar@proton.me. We love hearing from you. Until next week, though, farewell and take care.